What if I told you that the country making headlines today for the persecution of Christians is the same country where Christians got their name? Not Rome, not Jerusalem, not Greece, Syria. The city of Antioch, in what is today the Syrian border region, is where followers of Jesus were first called Christians. That word that billions of people use to describe themselves today was born in Syria, which means this is not a story about the gospel arriving in a foreign land. This is a story about the gospel coming home, and what happened when home became one of the most dangerous places on earth to believe. Before Rome had a pope, before Constantinople had a patriarch, before Europe had ever heard the name of Jesus, Syria already had a church. The road to Damascus, where a man named Saul was struck blind by a light from heaven and rose as Paul, one of history's most transformative figures, runs through this land. The earliest Christian communities outside of Israel planted their roots here, and it happened in Syria, on Syrian soil, among Syrian people. But here is the heartbreak at the center of this story. The land that gave Christianity its name has spent the last 14 centuries as a shrinking minority in its own home. Syrian Christians survived the Arab conquest, the Crusades, the Ottoman Empire, and the unspeakable brutality of ISIS. They kept their churches open. They kept their liturgies alive. They kept speaking the language of Jesus himself, Aramaic, when the rest of the world had long moved on. For over 1,000 years, ancient church Syria survival was not a theological concept. It was a daily act of courage. And now, right now, in 2025 and 2026, that survival is being tested more severely than at any point in modern history. A civil war that began in 2011 has devastated the country. A new Islamist government has declared Islamic law the foundation of the state. A suicide bombing destroyed a Damascus church in June 2025, killing dozens of worshippers. The Christian population of Syria, once 10% of the country, has collapsed to perhaps 2% or less. The oldest Christian communities on earth are disappearing, not through conquest, not through dramatic persecution alone, but through the quiet, devastating logic of Exodus, one family at a time, packing what they can carry and leaving the land their ancestors never left. This is the story of how the gospel came to Syria, how it survived 14 centuries of pressure, empire, and violence, and whether the church that gave Christianity its name will still exist by the end of this century. 5 chapters, 2,000 years, and a question that has no easy answer. Stay with me, because this story deserves to be told, and the people at the center of it deserve to be known. There is a question most Christians have never stopped to ask. Where exactly did Christianity begin? The answer is Syria. More specifically, the city of Antioch, one of the greatest metropolises of the ancient world. It was there, according to the book of Acts, that followers of Jesus were first called Christians. It wasn't a title they chose for themselves. It was a nickname given by outsiders, and it stuck forever. But Antioch was not just where the name was born. It was where the mission took shape. It was from Antioch that the Apostle Paul launched the missionary journeys that would carry the gospel across Asia Minor, through Greece, and eventually all the way to Rome. Antioch was the operational headquarters of the gospel, and Syrian Christians were its first collaborators, its first supporters, its first send-in community. And then there is Damascus, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, and the setting of one of the most dramatic moments in all of Christian history. A man named Saul of Tarsus was on his way to Damascus with a mission: arrest Christians and end this disruptive movement. And then, on a Syrian road, under a Syrian sky, a light knocked him to the ground. He was blind for 3 days, and when his sight returned, he was a different man entirely. The greatest persecutor of Christianity became its greatest propagator. And all of it happened in Syria. If this story is already stopping you in your tracks, hit subscribe. This trail is just beginning. In 636 or AD, Arab armies swept into Syria and changed everything. The Byzantine Christian Empire that had ruled the region for centuries collapsed almost overnight. And the Christians of Syria suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of history. But what happened next defied every expectation. They didn't disappear. They didn't convert en masse. They didn't flee. They stayed. And they negotiated something extraordinary: the right to keep their faith alive inside a new world that did not share it. The arrangement that allowed Syrian Christians to survive under Islamic rule was called the dhimmi system. Christians were permitted to practice their faith, maintain their churches, and govern their own internal affairs. In exchange, they paid a special tax called the jizya and accepted a second-class legal status. It was not equality, but it was survival. And Syrian Christians chose survival. They kept their heads down, their churches open, and their liturgies alive, generation after generation, in a land that was no longer officially theirs. What makes this story genuinely extraordinary is not just that they survived, it is how they survived. Syrian Christian scholars became some of the most important intellectuals of the early Islamic world. Men who prayed in Aramaic by night were translating Aristotle into Arabic by day. They were bridge builders between civilizations, between languages, between worlds. And in being indispensable to the culture around them, they bought themselves another century of survival, and then another, and then another. And yet, here is the detail that stops you cold. In the village of Maidlula, nestled in the mountains north of Damascus, there is a community of Christians who still speak Aramaic, not as a scholarly exercise, as their everyday language. The language of the marketplace, the kitchen, the family argument, the bedtime prayer, the language that Jesus spoke, alive, in Syria. That single fact tells you everything you need to know about the depth of what Christianity in Syria preserved across 14 centuries of minority existence. They didn't just keep the faith, they kept the very voice in which it was first spoken. While Western Christianity was busy with the Reformation and the Renaissance, Syrian Christians were quietly maintaining traditions so ancient that most of the Western Church had forgotten they ever existed. Liturgies written in the 3rd and 4th centuries, still sung word for word today. Monasteries built into desert cliffs that have been continuously inhabited for over 1,500 years. Syrian Christianity didn't evolve the way Western Christianity did because it never had the luxury of evolution. It was too busy surviving. And in surviving, it preserved. Take the monastery of Mar Musa, St. Moses, carved into a cliff face in the Syrian desert north of Damascus. It was founded in the 6th century. That means this monastery was already 600 years old when the first universities were being founded in Europe. Its walls are covered in Byzantine frescoes painted in the 11th and 12th centuries, images of saints and apostles that have watched over the same altar, the same liturgy, the same prayers, for nearly 1,000 years without interruption. When you stand inside Mar Musa, you are not visiting a museum. You are stepping into a living thread that connects directly, without a single broken link, to the earliest centuries of the faith. And perhaps nothing captures Syrian Christianity more powerfully than the language. Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, the language in which he said Abba, Father. In the mountain village of Malula, ordinary Syrian Christian families speak it at the dinner table. Children learn it not from textbooks, but from grandmothers. It is alive, or was alive, before the war scattered the community that had kept it breathing for 2,000 years. When you hear Aramaic spoken in Malula, you are hearing the closest living echo of the voice of Jesus that exists anywhere on earth. Syria received the faith and then became its custodian, preserving dimensions of early Christianity that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The rest of the Christian world owes a debt to these communities that it rarely acknowledges. And that debt makes what is happening to them today not just a humanitarian tragedy, but a loss for all of Christianity. Something irreplaceable is disappearing, and most of the world isn't even watching. In 2014, ISIS swept across northern Syria and Iraq, and almost immediately, they made their intentions toward Christian communities unmistakably clear. That was not collateral damage. This was targeted, deliberate elimination. Churches that had stood for 1,500 years were destroyed in days. Ancient manuscripts were burned. Christian families were given a choice not seen since the darkest chapters of medieval history. Convert, pay an impossible tax, flee, or face the consequences. Malula, that extraordinary village where people still spoke Aramaic, was attacked, its monastery ransacked, its community scattered. For the first time in 2,000 years, there were places in Syria where Christians simply no longer existed. And yet, not everyone left. There is a photograph that circulated widely after ISIS was driven from Malula. A group of villagers carrying a statue of the Virgin Mary back into the church from which it had been taken. Their faces are not triumphant. They are exhausted, determined, and quiet. That image is ancient church Syria survival in a single frame. Just people who refused, one more time, as their ancestors had refused for 14 centuries, to let the story end. In December 2024, Assad's regimes collapsed. The new Islamist-led government established Islamic jurisprudence as the principal source of legislation. For Syrian Christians who had already survived ISIS and watched their numbers collapse from 10% to perhaps 2%. This was not an abstract legal development. It was a signal. Then came June 2025. A suicide bomber struck the Mar Elias Greek Orthodox Church in Damascus during Sunday worship. Dozens were killed. Pastor Edward Awabde described it simply, "This was our hardest day." The feeling shared by Christians across the country that the walls were closing in. And yet, against every rational calculation, some are staying. Priests who could have emigrated to Europe are remaining with their congregations. They are making a deliberate, costly, eyes-wide-open choice to keep the liturgy going, to keep the Aramaic language alive, to keep the light on. Before the Civil War, Syria had 1.5 million Christians. Today, Fewer than 300,000 remain. Ancient church Syria survival has gone from a 14th century story of resilience to a genuine question of extinction. But the people who are staying believe that the church born in Antioch, launched from Damascus, sustained through 14 centuries of impossible odds, is not finished yet. The oldest church on earth is still breathing. Barely, but breathing. And sometimes, barely is enough. We have walked through 5 chapters of one of the oldest and most extraordinary stories in all of Christian history. We saw the road to Damascus, where a persecutor became an apostle, and the course of the entire faith was redirected on Syrian soil. We saw Antioch, where followers of Jesus received the name that billions of people still carry today. We saw 14 centuries of survival under empires that could have crushed these communities but didn't, because something in them refused, generation after generation, to be extinguished. We saw ancient monasteries carved into desert cliffs. We heard the Aramaic language, the voice of Jesus himself, still spoken in mountain villages by ordinary families who had no idea they were preserving something the rest of the world had lost. We saw ISIS tear through communities that had stood for 2,000 years. And we saw exhausted, determined hands carry a statue of Mary back into a ransacked church, not in triumph, but in quiet, unbreakable defiance. That image alone tells you everything about what ancient church Syria survival really means. And now we stand at the most urgent moment in the entire story. Fewer than 300,000 Christians remain in Syria. The people who preserved the language of Jesus, who sent Paul on the journeys that shaped the entire Christian world, who kept their liturgies alive through 14 centuries of pressure. Those people need the rest of the church to know they exist, to know their story, to refuse to let them disappear in silence. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because every episode in this series carries a story just like this one. A story of faith arriving in impossible circumstances and refusing, no matter the cost, to be extinguished. The trail doesn't end here. Subscribe, share this story, and we'll see you in the next episode.